To have with us Pedro Gellert, who's from Mexico City. He's a journalist and an interpreter, but more importantly, he's one of the founding members of a NGO called the Coordinating Committee for Solidarity with Palestine. He also manages and administrates a Mexican website called Jews for Palestine. And today Pedro is going to try to help us understand what some of the current situation in Israel and Palestine is about, perhaps who bears responsibility for what, and what we might think about doing going forward. Pedro, welcome.
Thanks again for the invitation. It's always great to get out of Mexico City and see San Miguel de Allende. I assume about half the people here, maybe a third of the people, saw the movie Occupation 101 yesterday. Okay, so I want to deal, of course, with the Palestine question and with some of the theoretical and practical questions in dispute among both supporters of Palestine and in general people who address the conflict. I know this is a difficult or complicated issue. Unlike the question of Cuba, for example, or Vietnam, where you had one leadership and people who were in solidarity with that struggle was very clear. In the case of Palestine, you have many different political forces at play. And necessarily the question of Palestine leads to an examination of the Jewish question, which is also very complicated and with a lot of different forces involved. So it's a complicated issue that has very different aspects and variants to it. I'm used to speaking to a Mexican audience. In addition to the fact that it's the first time I've ever spoken English on Palestine, I've never spoken to a predominantly American audience on that. And in Mexico, in my circle at least, which is social sectors, trade unionists, I've spoken to peasant organizations on Palestine, neighborhood organizations, student groups, and even in upper-class universities such as the Ibero, where there are a lot of Jewish students, I find virtually 100% support for Palestine. Part of it's a natural tendency of solidarity on the part of Mexicans toward other third world peoples. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's no real debate, and there's a very low level of understanding of the conflict. There is also less consciousness in Mexico on the question of anti-Semitism. I'll give you an example. We had a rally at the Cuban embassy several years ago, and some guy on the street asked for the mic, and they gave it to him. And he said something about the Jews being responsible for Hiroshima. And I thought he was going to say something about the Jewish scientists with the Manhattan Project. I asked him afterwards. He goes, no. He goes, it's because of Harry Solomon Truman. Okay, I said to him, I said, he's not Jewish. His father was a Presbyterian. Okay, in the United States, no one would say that Harry Truman was Jewish, and maybe just be ridiculous. But in Mexico, all sorts of idiotic things. So people don't know, and it's not, an issue before the population. On the other side, people don't have experience with fascist groups like in the United States. We had a demonstration sponsored, several groups from the National Autonomous University of Mexico had a demonstration at the Israeli embassy around the question of Gaza. And after discussions with us, with the Solidarity in Palestine, we have a line, we do not allow anti-Semitic elements at our demonstration. And a far-right fascist group showed up and they excluded them. And they started yelling at the students, they were Jewish communists. Okay, for Mexicans, this 1930s fascist type argument with Jewish students, what on earth are you talking about? Most Mexicans see the Mexican Jewish community as a very upper-class, privileged sector of society, not as a source of communist agitation. So it's a different situation than Europe and the United States. And conspiracy theories in Mexico have a lot more weight than in the United States. I think part of it is when you have a country that is not fully in control of its own destiny, like Mexico, where forces outside the country, particularly the United States, play such an important role, it lends itself a lot more to type of conspiracy theories, as well as the decline of Marxism. That is, many people, I mean, in the 1960s, it was more common to view the capitalism as an economic, political, social system with an analysis and stuff. Today, a lot of people view the forces as the secret conspiratorial elite working behind the scenes, which is very different from the classical Marxist interpretation of capitalism. So I want to address some of the theoretical questions and solutions to the conflict. First, on what is Zionism? I suppose for people here, a lot of this is not going to be a new issue, which for most Mexicans it is. As we know, at the turn of the last century, there were about 11 million Jews in Europe, the vast majority in Eastern Europe. And from a Marxist point of view, the analysis was a people class. That is, Jews performed a certain economic function in Eastern Europe as a result of historic persecution and other issues I don't have time to go into. And they also represented a specific ethnic group. It's been common among many supporters of Palestine for a long time to try to deny that there was a specific ethnic component of being Jewish. But there's no question, and Lenin, there's an argument in European Marxism if Jews were a nation, a nationality, or an ethnic group, but there's no question that there was an ethnic component. And that they lived in compact ghettos, they had their own language, their own culture, etc. As the economic crisis of capitalism in the late 1800s intensified, anti-Semitism grew massively, particularly in countries like Poland and the Baltic states in Central Europe, as the middle class viewed Jews as competitors. In response to this rise of anti-Semitism, there were three types of responses. One, assimilation, particularly in countries such as France, Great Britain, and Germany. That was not an option in Eastern Europe, both due to the intensity of the economic crisis and the fact that the Jews formed such a compact and defined national group. Socialism, with its many, many, many different variants. You had the Jewish Bund, which was a Jewish socialist party. You had social democrats, both the Mensheviks and later Bolsheviks, and you had communists. Even in the case of Mexico, in the 1930s, the dominant trend in the Jewish community in Mexico was left-wing. The Mexican Communist Party had a weekly in Yiddish until 1956. A couple of months ago, I went to a presentation in Mexico City of the Mexican chapter of the Jewish Bund. They call itself, talk about a little out of it. The Jewish, the Jewish Workers' Labor League of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, Mexico chapter. It was very interesting. It was a very interesting event, but they were a very important group at the time. And there were also left Zionists. You know, when you look at some of their writings, the debates between the Marxists and the left Zionists and things, they were in Europe, and they really weren't that much about the Palestinians. They were more about what role Zionism was playing in the Jewish community. That is, that the left, the Social Democrats, the Communists, the Socialists, and the Bundists said the place of Jews is to fight for equality in Poland and Lithuania, in Russia, and the Zionists said, no, we have to have our own state. We can never be a safe minority in non-Jewish society, but it's not so much about Palestinians. And the third type of response was Zionism, which was a very minority movement in every case. Most Jews saw Zionism as giving in to anti-Semitism, which was definitely the case. And for example, in Poland, which had the largest Jewish population, in 1939, the last year that there were elections before the German invasion, of the 30 seats in the Warsaw City Council of the Jewish population, the Zionists only had one seat, and the rest were mainly the Jewish Bund. The Russian Revolution was a tremendous pole of attraction, not only in Eastern Europe, even in places like Mexico and the United States. I come from a communist family. My grandmother told the joke that it was after the revolution in now it's Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, and a Jewish guy gets on a tram and says to the conductor, the driver, as he's passing the street, he goes, this is formerly Tsar Nicholas Street, now it's the Communism Avenue, and all the changes and stuff. And then a Jewish guy gets on and he goes, good day, comrade, formerly Dirty Jew. So it was a tremendous thing. It was for the first time in human history, you had a political movement that took power, that proclaimed the equality of all nationalities, and that very consciously rejected colonialism, imperialism, any sort of racial or ethnic superiority. And this had a tremendous impact. Part of this, unfortunately, is a hidden history that has been completely erased. And there's no doubt the Zionist, that secular Jewish left-wing internationalist culture is equally despised by right-wing fascists and by Zionists. So you have examples, phenomenal examples in European history that are completely unknown. In Amsterdam, there's a beautiful statue. Virtually no one knows this. In Amsterdam, when the deportations began in 1942, the dock workers under Trotskyist-like leadership, the Revolutionary Socialist League, with Trotskyist and communist participation, called a general strike which shut down Amsterdam against the deportations. This is not mentioned. There was the uprising in the Vilnius ghetto, which was under communist leadership. This is not mentioned. Even the Warsaw ghetto, which of course is a very public event, it was a united front. There was one political faction excluded from that united front: the Zionist revisionists, who are today in power in Israel. It was basically a united front of the Bund communists and left-wing Zionists. When they took control of the ghetto, they raised not the blue and white Zionist flag, they raised two flags: the red and white flag of Poland and the red flag of socialism. But this is a history that is largely forgotten and increasingly forgotten. That there's some interesting, I brought some movies and stuff that if people are interested, we can watch on that. Okay, Zionism had some problems. What did it have to offer? Apart from Jews who may or may not support it. It was a colonial project that set up a Jewish homeland. So first they, of course, went to there are two forces in Palestine. Population who lives there, of which Jews were between 6 and 10%, and the colonial powers at the time, either those that were in control of Palestine or the European powers in general. And the Zionists went to all of the colonial powers, offering deals to make it support British influence. They went with Turkey, they went to Germany. They even offered, talk about desperate, they even offered to, if the Polish government would support efforts, they even offered to make Palestine a Polish colony, which I don't think the Polish government really thought they were going to get away with. That was part of it, that they would be an outpost of Western civilization, or British civilization, whatever the case might be. And the other aspect is they very consciously offered, in the case of Tsarist Russia, but also to the British, that Zionism would be a counterweight to the influence of the left and to Bolshevism among young Jews. Very open to Pleve, who was the Tsarist Minister of the Interior, because Zionism is the way to contain the revolutionary movement among the Jewish masses. It was a very open alliance on that level. Even Churchill, in the discussions around the Balfour Project, the sections of the British ruling class who supported the Balfour Declaration in Zionism said that was the way to combat communism in the Jewish population. So there were only these two forces in play in Palestine: colonial powers and the native population. And you obviously could not ally with the native population if your objective was to create a homeland in which they were not going to be part of. The Zionist project was concretized with this Balfour Declaration in 1917. We call it the wedding ring between Zionism and imperialism. Today, when we discuss this, it's much clearer to people. You know, in 1917, I said, except for basically the communist left, no one in the world questioned the right to have colonies and colonialism, imperialism. Today, you know, it doesn't take, you know, a Marxist theoretician or something, or a rabid radical to say, what right did one country have to give away another country to another people? It seems logical and very, you know, reasonable argument. Okay, that's one aspect that I want to deal with. Now, what type of society was constructed by the Zionists? And I want to get into some theoretical aspects of this. It was a colonial state, that is, they sought to bring people in as settlers, but different from other colonial enterprises. For example, the Portuguese had Angola or Mozambique as colonies, but they weren't colonial, but when Angola won its independence, or Mozambique, the handful of Portuguese who were there went back to Portugal. This was different. It was more like South Africa, where you had efforts to colonize, a massive colonization of European, basically, settlers. And we call it a colonial settler state. That is not only the thing of colonialism, but the fact that you had a massive settler movement. It was different from South Africa, however. In South Africa, the idea was to exploit the native black labor in the mines and in agriculture and in industry, and live off that super exploitation. In the question of Palestine, that was not the objective. The objective was to expel the native population. They had campaigns of Hebrew-only labor, and to create a Jewish working class and farmers through the kibbutz to displace the native laboring class. At first, it was an artificial process, but today, of course, the reality is that you have a nation, a nationality in Israel. You're not talking about a handful of Portuguese living in Angola. You have a new nation in Israel that's different from the Jewish population of Poland or other countries. Of course, this had a very cruel side. All variants of Zionism, especially left-wing versions, had this thing of purchasing land from absentee landowners and expelling the Palestinian peasants, of the Avoda Ivrit, the Hebrew labor campaign, of excluding Palestinian workers and hiring Jewish workers in their place, and even the kibbutzim. They were only for Jews. They did not allow Arab members. One of the documentaries I brought is about volunteers from Palestine who went to fight in Spain in the Civil War. And several of these people said that they came to Palestine as settlers in the Zionist movement, and when they saw what was being done to the Arab workers, said, we want no part of this. And that they broke at that moment from Zionism. The movie, it's, let's see if I yes, just fortunately it's on the top. Madrid before Hanita. Hanita was the name of a kibbutz, and when the Zionists said, your role is here in Hanita, and the people in the movie said, no, if we want to fight fascism, our place is in Madrid, against fascism in the Spanish Civil War. But okay, so that's what we say, that Zionism was a racist project from the beginning. The idea was not to share a homeland, was not a binational state. The idea was to create a Jewish state in a country where Jews represented 6 to 10% of the population. The idea was never to live in peace. It was to create a state, which I'll get into in a minute, which is now much clearer, a state based on ethnic, not citizenship criteria. Today, and when I'm talking about today, I'm talking about the last 2 or 3 weeks, this is much, much clearer with this new nationality, Jewish nation-state law in Israel. It says openly, in the land, that land, only Jews have the right to self-determination. It allows for, not allows for, the law promotes Jewish settlement, not only in Israel proper, but also in the entire land of historic Palestine. It allows the existence of ethnically pure villages and towns, that is permissible in Israel to exclude Arabs. In fact, the Jewish National Fund, which is a semi-official agency in charge of purchasing land, it controls 92% of land in Israel. The Jewish National Fund excludes Arabs from any purchases of land and homes. And it says it defines the state as a state of the Jews, not of the citizens, which is very different. For example, in Mexico, anybody born in Mexico is Mexican. You know, parents came from Ethiopia, whatever the case might be, anyone born in Mexico is Mexican, and the state defines itself as a state of Mexican citizens. But in Israel, not everyone born in Israel is Jewish. 20% of the population is Arab. And they are excluded. They are, at best, second-class citizens. They are living in somebody else's state. This is one of the few places, we're not talking about a theocracy. Israel's also a theocracy. And particularly the secular Jewish community, which is a majority, resents the fact that there's no public transportation on the Sabbath, that Orthodox Judaism rabbis can perform marriages, all sorts of things. And a lot of countries have that type of theocracy. This is an ethnocracy, which is much more dangerous and much more racist. Because it's based, I said, it's not based on citizenship criteria. The Arab deputies in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, tried to introduce a law very often that the state is a state of its citizens, and that all citizens have equal rights in the state. And they would not even allow it to be discussed. In fact, there's a law in Israel that to be a candidate, you have to accept the Jewish character of the state. Okay, what's the current situation? Unfortunately, Israel is increasingly militarist and racist, particularly among youth. That is, when you have opinion polls, even when people hail, okay, you have a majority are against expelling Palestinians, but you will have like 40 or 45% in the majority of youth in favor of incredibly racist things of expelling Palestinian citizens of Israel. A majority say they do not want to live next door to a Palestinian. All sorts of incredible things that in any other country would be a mammoth scandal if it came to light. But in Israel, you have an increasingly racist and increasingly militarist society. These settlements, under all governments in Israel, including the Labour Party, there's been a growth of the illegal settlements in the occupied territories. It's illegal under UN law. A conquering power is not allowed to establish settlements. There are at the current time, between 600,000 and 700,000 Palestinian Israelis living in the settlements in the West Bank. They have their own roads. They have priority on water resources. They are under different, you have a situation, you can have two villages side by side, and they're not under the same law. The Israeli settlements are under Israeli law, and the Palestinians do not have the right to vote. They are stateless, basically. And also, as I said, there is a list of I think 60 or something racist laws in the state of Israel. And the situation is increasingly negative in that. Netanyahu, who's like the Israeli version of Trump, says, God gave us this land. He's talking about all of historic Palestine. God gave us this land, and we're not giving any of it back. Among people less devoted to biblical interpretations, because particularly in the West, for most American Jews saying, God gave us something sounds correctly like something from 100 or 200 years ago. Then people say, oh, it's the Jews returning to their historic homeland. Okay, there is no precedent in international law for people 2,000 years later coming back and saying, well, this is our homeland, you got to leave. That's beyond the debate on whether the Jews in Eastern Europe are the direct lineal descendants of the ancient Hebrews. There's a whole bunch of debate on, there's no such thing as pure racists. Every people have gone through a process of assimilation with other peoples and things like that. And new genetical studies coming out with, you know, different conclusions and stuff, that yes, there seem to be some genetic material in common with the different Jewish communities, which, by the way, a lot of the genetic studies say are also shared with Palestinians. I was in the airplane once, I saw an interesting article in Scientific American. I was saying over breakfast that they did a study of Poles, ethnic Poles, and Polish Jews. And they saw that the Polish Jews had things in common with ethnic Poles, but they had differences, they had genetic differences. Then they compared the Polish Jews with Palestinians, and they found that they had things in common with Palestinians that the ethnic Poles did not have, and they had differences. Okay. Then they compared blacks in the United States with Africans. Okay, there might be a debate on where Polish Jews originally came from. There's no debate on where blacks in the United States originally came from. That's sort of given. And they found that in a very short period of time, we're not talking about tens of thousands of years, in a very short period of time, a couple of hundred years, the blacks in the United States had genetic material in common with white Americans that they did not have with Africans, and of course had things in common with Africans. But this issue has not been resolved, and even if it did, I said, you know, race, it's a fluid concept, people are a mixture. Everyone who goes for a DNA test finds out they're like 5% African and all sorts of other things. It's not a scientific category. We leave it to fascists to discuss pure races, not among ourselves. Either argument, either the God gave us this land and we're not giving it back, or that the people returning to their homeland 2,000 years later, both of these arguments immediately and explicitly rule out any possibility of peaceful settlement. It's basically saying this is our land and no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And the amazing thing is that the Western powers accept this type of logic, which would not be in the case of anybody else. Okay. What is the situation in the Palestinian sector? Okay, you have formally the PLO leadership, the Palestine National Authority under Abbas, is committed to a two-state solution. The fact is that parts of that Palestinian leadership, and parts of Palestinian society in the West Bank, not in Gaza, benefit economically from the occupation. There is no question, no doubt about that. They are irritated by border controls and a lot of repressive measures, but part of the PLO leadership does benefit economically from that. That is not the case in Gaza, but even among youth in the West Bank, Hamas has been able to fill the void. Why? Because all of these peace processes have resulted in absolutely no gain whatsoever for the Palestinians. When the dominant power, Israel, backed by the United States and Britain and the Western world, enters the peace process saying, Jerusalem is off the table, they're not giving back land from the settlements, maybe some sort of Palestinian rule, but in isolated areas, and will not have a right to have an army, etc., with a blockade of God. With all of this, it's not surprising that the level of frustration allows a group like Hamas to fill the void. This policy of ethnic cleansing, which has continued since the establishment of the State of Israel and continues to this day, not only in the territories, even within Israel, where you still have a situation of Bedouin villages being demolished to make way for Jewish settlements within the State of Israel. The brutal blockade of Gaza in the last few weeks, Israel is not allowing electricity in. And the complete and utter failure of Oslo and the other peace talks. So with Israel and with the U.S. backing saying Jerusalem's off the table, the right of refugees to return, as decided by the UN, is off the table, that settlements will continue, and there can be some self-rule but not quite a Palestinian state. and the Israeli settlements will remain, okay, there is no question that this feeds feelings of desperation and including support for terrorism. Because what avenue, what nonviolent, peaceful avenue is open to achieve the goal of a real self-rule in a real Palestinian state? Okay, so there were the first Intifada in 1987-1991, and the second Intifada in 2000-2005, the latest developments in Gaza. Today, 2/3 of the Palestinian population favor a single state, which had not been the case in the past, with a majority support for armed resistance and attacks. Okay, what would be the ideal solution? Okay, the two-state theory, two-state solution, is still in theory supported. Sometimes Netanyahu even says that, although not too many people believe that. That's still the official line of the Western powers. Within Israel, most sectors of the Israeli left, and that includes the Communist Party, which is the majority current in the Palestinian sector within Israel. Most sectors of the Israeli left have the slogan of pretty interesting sounding slogan, 2 people, 2 states, 1 future, which sounds very nice, but runs up against some very hardcore realities. Supposedly Obama was shocked when he saw the map of Palestine, the West Bank, and saw how deeply controlling the Israeli settlements were. So there's real questions on whether this is really possible. There's a new initiative in the last couple of months for the single-state solution called the OTS, One Democratic State. It's an initiative by Israeli intellectuals and young activists and important sectors in the Palestinian community, also Palestinian intellectuals, but sectors of Palestinian youth and Palestinian civil society, for precisely that, for a single state in all of historical Palestine, based on complete equality between the 2 peoples that live in the state, and a recognition, and this is important from a Palestinian point of view. Historically, the Palestinians, the progressive sectors, when they discussed the situation, they talked about 3 religious communities, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. Now, I think it's an advance, you're speaking about 2 ethnic communities, Palestinian and Israeli, because it's not a religious question. It's a national question, and the Palestinian struggle is a national liberation struggle. So this is a new initiative. They're still going through a lot of questions that have to be resolved. Okay, finally I want to mention a little about the role of the United States and the Israel lobby. Israel receives more aid than any other country. Despite being a small country of about 7 million inhabitants, every year it receives $3.8 billion in U.S. aid. There's no other country that receives that amount of aid. And it receives the aid even when, under Obama, Israel would do things that the United States was against. It is aid that is given no matter what Israel does. And some of the stuff with the United States and Israel just takes on surreal dimensions. All over the United States, there are efforts in state legislatures to criminalize the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And this is how, if Israel wants to do that within their country, okay. But it's incredible that in the United States, it is going to be illegal to boycott Israel. It's another country. What logic does the Pennsylvania legislator adopt a thing saying that people can't boycott another sovereign country, correctly or incorrectly? Any criticism of Israel is immediately, as you all know, labeled anti-Semitic, which of course is very unfortunate because it blinds people to real incidences of anti-Semitism, which obviously have to be fought. The question that's under debate is whether Israel is dictating American foreign policy in the Middle East, why does the United States support Israel? In other words, is it the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog, to put it more colloquially? A lot of the debate is centered on the Israeli lobby. Most left-wing groups reject the idea that the Israeli lobby is responsible for U.S. policy in the Middle East. Although, of course, it is a factor that enters into it. Most people who I know say that it's absurd to think that the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful capitalist class in the world, is going to allow its foreign policy to be manipulated by a lobby, on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's a dangerous implication. That is, if you say that it's due to the Israeli lobby or the influence of the American Jewish community or whatever that the U.S. has this policy in the Middle East, you're implying that if it weren't for the Israeli lobby, et cetera, then U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East would be more progressive and more democratic. That is clearly not the case. The United States supports Israel for geopolitical, for strategic reasons, because Israel best defense, is the most stable and loyal ally of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. That is the basis. If there was not one single Jewish voter in the United States, the U.S. would have the same position, for example, that Japan has. That is, that it supports Israel, and in fact, the U.S. uses Israel. Since Israel has a stable state with a right-wing government, it uses Israel, for example, to support dictatorships throughout Latin America that the United States could not openly support. The Somozas in Nicaragua, the Stroessners in Panama, the military dictatorship in Argentina, etc., etc. They use Israel to sell arms to countries that will be in uproar in the United States because of their human rights violations. Israel is a stable outpost for Western interests in the Middle East. Basically what the Zionists were using to sell the project. Ironically, the American Jewish community, contrary to this thing about the Jews controlling American foreign policy, actually it's the Trump supporters and the evangelical Christians who are much more rabidly pro-Zionist than most of the American Jewish community. The majority of the American Jewish community is in favor of a peace agreement, a two-state solution. Most American Jews are embarrassed by the nation state. The people who are most pro-Zionist in the United States are the right-wing Christians. They, of course, don't have the emotional attachment to the question of Israel that the Jewish population might have. But in terms of political alignments, there's no question that the Trump base of support is much, much, much more in favor of the Netanyahu government than the majority of American Jews, and the majority increasing, depends on how you ask the question, between 40 and 60% of young Jews in the United States openly say that Israel is an obstacle to peace, that Israel is theocratic, that the Palestinians are getting a raw deal, depending, of course, on how the question is asked. But there is a definite process of Jewish youth taking their distance from Israel, and Israel is very, 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 very concerned about this development. Okay. Okay. There is actually an interesting alignment, and this is, well, it's nothing new, it's the historical alignment between anti-Semites and Zionism. And this is coming to the fore in the last couple of months with the increasing alignment of the Israeli government with extremist right-wing and anti-Semitic elements in Europe. The visit, I think it was last week, of the Hungarian leader to Israel, alignment with anti-Semitic forces in Poland, sectors of the British National Front, the traditional British fascist group, were extremely pro-Israel. It's also the case in the United States. So it's a very interesting situation where the government state that was supposedly formed to protect Jews from anti-Semitism is in fact aligning with the most right-wing anti-Semitic elements on a world scale. The original Zionist argument, of course, is that Jews needed a safe homeland. The irony of this situation is that 70 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, Jews are less safe in Israel than in most countries around the world. The existence of Zionism has made Jews more vulnerable and less safe throughout the world than had previously been the case. Is there a progressive and democratic solution? This is not going to be easy. Nobody thinks it's going to be easy, but it offers the promised Palestinians of achieving a homeland, and it offers the promise to Israelis of being able to live in peace and security in the region with their neighbors. And that is a very grandiose and noble task, but I don't see too much alternative because as the situation is at the current state, it's interesting, there was a study by the Israeli army, the Israeli government didn't like it, but there was a study by the Israeli army that at this moment there are more Palestinians than Israelis. There's some debate on whether that includes people outside of historic Palestine, refugees living in the Gulf states or things, but let's even say 50%, 50%. You have a situation with the Israeli government refusing to allow a Palestinian state where Israel will be not only an apartheid regime which currently exists in reference to the Palestinians in the occupied territories and within Israel, but a permanent situation where the Jewish state will be governing over a majority non-Jewish population with a policy aimed at permanent discrimination and displacement of that population. And if anyone thinks that is the road to peace and that the future is going to be bright for the people, and for both peoples who live inside of Israel, they're really crazy on that level. So it's a difficult situation, it is a complicated situation, but it is a struggle that both because of the role that the United States plays, the traditional role that the Jewish community has played in social struggles in the United States and around the world, and the question of world peace, that support for the Palestinians is an integral part of any progressive agenda in the world today.
Thank you, Pedro, for a very enlightening perspective on the Israeli-Palestine situation. We have ample time for some questions and discussion. We'd like to ask you to keep your remarks, if you choose to make some, to just a couple of minutes. We'd like to mostly see people asking questions because we have a resource here that is unique in San Miguel today, and we should take advantage of that. So, having said that, does somebody like to lead off with a question for Pedro? Yes.
Well, the speaker said that the Western countries support Israel.
I'm sorry, pardon?
That he said that the Western countries support Israel. But at the United Nations, there have been, I think, 40 sanctions that were vetoed by the United States against Israel. So I don't see that they really support Israel, the majority of the Western countries. It's only the United States, because the rest have voted for the settlements, against the settlements, against the occupation, etc., etc.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more questions and then Pedro can respond to these. Anybody else? Yes, in the back.
Yes, I'm curious about that figure, the 3.8 billion in annual aid from the U.S. to Israel. You could talk about a component of that is military.
It's military.
Military is separate from that, and does anyone feel like they really have a handle on what the military aid actually is that passes to and through Israel.
Okay, another question here in front.
I was just going to ask, I thought I did not hear you, I may be wrong about this, but I thought I did not hear you use the term ethnic cleansing at all.
Yes, I did.
You did? Okay, I apologize.
Okay. Pedro.
Okay, well, when I talk about Western countries, I'm talking about the Western powers. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, even Russia. I'm not talking about third world countries that, you know, non-Arab third world countries. Yeah, it's true, Israel has violated more UN resolutions than any other country in the world. No question on that. The UN, even the original partition resolution, said that they had to be a right for the return of refugees, and Jerusalem is an international city, which is obviously not the case. But there's no question that the principal Western powers back Israel. Even there was a case, there was a big surprise when the Obama representative of the United States in the UN abstained on, I think it was a question on settlements, which was a big surprise. But none of these motions come with sanctions. They are verbal declarations, but they don't come with sanctions, as has been the case of either North Korea, Burma, lots of other countries. So it's basic, and a question of the military aid also, it was a free pass. People always say Israel is being held to a standard that not of other countries. Well, that's ridiculous. It's quite the contrary. Any other country that proclaimed that its existence is based on an ethnic criteria, not a citizenship criteria, would be cut off from any sort of aid and would be considered outside the family of civilized nations. It's quite the opposite. So yes, there have been lots and lots and lots of resolutions in the UN on the refugee question, on the settlements, on different Israeli atrocities, but they're in the General Assembly and they do not come with any sort of sanctions. I saw the figure, that figure on the military aid. I think it's basically that the Israelis can basically do what they want with that money. The UN, this thing about the double standard is incredible. Yes, it's a double standard in the exact opposite sense of the term. Not that Israel is being held to some impossible to meet criteria, quite the contrary. That it's getting away, literally getting away with murder in the world community in the United Nations. And this was also the same argument, by the way, that South Africans used. That the South Africa, why don't you talk about the human rights violations in Mongolia or whatever the case, why about South Africa? And they also used, by the way, in Israel, it's interesting, the same argument that racists used in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. That the Israelis say, oh, the Palestinian citizens of Israel in 1948 borders have a higher standard of living than in some of the surrounding countries. That's the exact argument that racists used in the South, that American blacks had a higher standard of living than in Africa, so why are they complaining? It's very interesting, the exact same arguments. The South Africa situation as well. It is, in some levels, the Israeli situation is worse than South Africa. It doesn't have some of the more blatant aspects of having park benches only for Jews and stuff like that. It does have some, by the way, in the West Bank, some of that is true. There are Israeli-only roads. License plates are different in the West Bank than in Israel proper. It doesn't have some of that more blatant aspect to it. But on the other hand, on some levels, it's much, much worse. Some of the South African leaders of the fight against apartheid says a lot of the Israeli repressive laws are much, much stricter and much more racist than in the case of South Africa. In fact, Israel, that was one of the things I said about the role of Israel as a strategic ally. Israel was able to provide aid to South Africa, including in the field of nuclear power, nuclear technology, that the other Western states could not do because their own populations, particularly the United States, would not have supported that type of open alliance with the apartheid government in South Africa. Israel had no problems whatsoever, and I said that's one of reasons that Israel receives so much aid and is considered such a strategic ally and is allowed to get away with, literally get away with murder and a level of repression. When you see the figures of the number of Palestinians imprisoned, it's just astronomical. There's no other case in the world today, even places like the dictatorship in Turkey and stuff, that does not come close, percentage-wise, to the repression in Israel and Palestine.
Your comment on the ethnic cleansing?
Well, I had mentioned that it's a constant policy. It is going on. I said not only in the territories, it is going on within Israel proper. You have in virtually throughout Israel, it is impossible in Arab villages for its residents to receive permits for new housing construction. While for Jewish, not only settlements, for Jewish areas, there's no problem whatsoever. In the area of Jerusalem, there's a real problem with that. You have the birth rate among Arab families is very, very high. They cannot build, they can add to their homes. You have all sorts of things throughout Israel. Right now, the major fight on this has been in terms of demolishing Bedouin villages within the state of Israel. I'm not talking about the occupied territories, within the state of Israel, to make way for Jewish settlements. And that's been a big fight, supported, by the way, by progressive Israelis. But it's a thing even where the other courts in other countries wouldn't consider such a measure. You're talking in these cases of Arab citizens of the state of Israel. That it's interesting. One of the mechanisms for discrimination, sometimes it's not as openly blatant in South Africa, but the effect is the exact same. One of the ways of getting around being so openly discriminatory is that to get a loan or whatever the case might be, that the person has to have been in army service. Okay, there's a problem. The Orthodox Jews don't go in the army. So the way to get that is that they have to have army service unless they were excused for religious reasons. The Arabs excused for national reasons, not for religious reasons. But you've got that whole thing is aimed, it's been from the beginning, it is aimed at ethnic cleansing. It is not, a lot of people use the term Holocaust and stuff. It is not a Holocaust in the sense that, there are no gas chambers, it's not an extermination campaign. But, lots of horrible things happen in the world that don't rise to the level of Nazi Germany. I mean, that can't be a thing, oh, well, it's not, they don't have extermination camps, therefore it's not that bad. It's the same thing in South Africa. There was no efforts in South Africa to kill off the native population. They wanted them to work in the mines and in industry and the agriculture and stuff like that. But it's a policy of ethnic cleansing that has been going on constantly, to make life miserable, particularly in the West Bank, to make life miserable and to try to encourage immigration outside of the area to be able to populate it with more Jewish settlers.
Jim?
A lot of what you're saying is not reported in the New York Times or in the American media. And I'll give an example. The Canadian Broadcasting Company, CBC, reported in May that Dr. Tarek Lubani, who is an associate professor at the University of Ontario, and 19 paramedics were hundreds of yards beyond the fence. They were near the fence. There was a lull in the fighting during the Great Return of the Palestinians, the big so-called uprising that was going on. They were shot by Israeli snipers, not rubber bullets, but real ammunition in their legs. One of the paramedics was killed, and they were all wearing medical garb, truly identified as medical personnel. I went on the New York Times and a few U.S. papers. There was one reference to the whole Palestinian thing saying, well, by and large, it was really nonviolent. But there was no actual reporting of the fact that 16,000 Palestinians had been wounded, over 160 were murdered, and that the Israeli forces, just killed a lot of those people and wounded them and violated everything in international law. What I'm curious about is what's going on with the American media? I mean, shocking.
AIPAC owns
Not
them.
the only
Great. Maybe another question there?
Does the American military have a physical presence in Israel, or IDF is just their proxy?
Yeah, no, there's no soldiers. American Jews are allowed to fight in the Israeli army, and I think that's a case that's not allowed in other countries to be able to serve in that. But there's quite a, so they're having, as I said, they're having now problems with young American Jews. But traditionally, American Jews have been welcome to serve in the Israeli army, and the U.S. does not allow that in the case of other countries.
Yes.
Didn't this investment in South Africa contribute to the end of apartheid?
Yeah.
And what would have to be the conditions in the United States at this time for a similar campaign, not only in the United States, elsewhere, to have any effect at all?
Okay, there is a campaign, the BDS. Here in Mexico, there's not that much either Israeli investment or, for example, I mean, the amount of Israeli products that are sold in the stores to make a campaign. It's, we're talking about a couple of boxes of matzah and some other stuff. No, in the United States, you have, a lot of places around the world, you have Israeli flowers. And very often, we'll have small campaigns, but like on a symbolic thing about selling Israeli homes in the university, where you'll get a majority support against it. But now some European countries, Ireland, Iceland, are trying to officially have a boycott. It's a pressure tactic. In the case of South Africa, there was not, unlike Israel, there was not many South African products where the boycott was on a level of going into a supermarket, don't buy South African what? There's wine, but it's not. You could go your life without finding things from South Africa in a supermarket. But it had a very strong, it politically isolated the government. And the divestment, which is on an institutional level, in Israel is causing, they say, and I saw a figure, I think they said it was $5 billion. The Israeli government has made it illegal in Israel to advocate the boycott. And people abroad, including mayors of French cities that support the boycott, are not allowed into Israel. So the Israeli government's feeling the heat. I think it's more of a political isolation than the actual economic impact of that. But Israel has never been so isolated. And the Israeli press has lots of articles almost every day saying that this is now irreversible, that the government has never, the state has never been so isolated and repudiated. And they're very, very concerned. They have a huge propaganda campaign designed to counteract that. A lot of that, ironically, they try to present the country as a beacon, for example, for gay liberation, which compared to the rest of the Arab East isn't that difficult, isn't that hard. But it's interesting because in Israel you have anti-occupation groups in the gay community that come with signs, no pride in occupation. But there's also problems with that because Israel uses that not only for propaganda, they use it to blackmail gay Palestinians into being informers. And they threaten Palestinian gays that they'll out them to their family and their community if they don't collaborate. But even so, by the way, Israel recently, there's huge demonstrations. So the law prohibiting gay adoption stuff. And a lot of these demonstrations are attacked. The religious fanatics are religious fanatics every place. And the Israeli ultra-Orthodox, the hard wing, the hard right of the Zionist movement, basically have the same social program in terms of gays and women and stuff as a lot of the Arab all fundamentalists. But I saw some figures. I think the Israeli government might have been exaggerating even the impact of the boycott in order to pass this legislation. I'm not that sure that the boycott has had that much of an economic effect, but it's had a huge political impact.
But on a level of industrial investment, intellectual investments, would have a considerably more important impact, wouldn't it?
And that I'm not that sure. The Israeli economy actually is growing a lot. It's had for computer science, computers, technology, and stuff like that. The Israeli economy is not in bad shape. I'm not that sure. The Israeli government says that the boycott is having a bad effect. I'm not sure if they're not exaggerating it to whip up the population against the left. And there's a huge campaign in Israel accusing the left of being traitors and being on the BDS movement and stuff like that. I'm not that sure. I said it has more of a symbolic, for example, I think the Methodist Church in the US is going to divest. I'm not sure how much Israel bonds. I'm not sure how much of that really has a deep economic. I think it's more politically isolating. I think in the case of South Africa as well, it was a pariah. That is, Israel is becoming what it should be, a pariah state viewed as being racist by definition and subjecting the native population to a policy of ethnic cleansing. That's what I think they fear most, that this image is now beginning for the first time in 70 years to have an impact in popular opinion.
Did you want to comment about the impunity with which the military appears to operate in Israel?
I thought he was talking about the U.S. I don't think there are any U.S. bases whatsoever in Israel. I've never seen U.S. soldiers. I've been to there a few times. I've never seen U.S. soldiers in the street or anything like that.
Jim's comment about the assassination of 160.
Oh yeah, no. That's as I said, it's had a big impact on world opinion. That, as always, Israel, retaliates with, brutally against any sort of Palestinian resistance, which makes it, very understandable why people don't see, a Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi way of peacefully protesting and appealing to the conscience of the occupying power. And it's been a real serious repression in the West Bank as well, and even within Israel. There were solidarity demonstrations by both Arab and Jewish citizens of Israel in solidarity with Gaza that were brutally broken up by the police in Haifa and in other cities.
Peter, you're next.
Can you talk a little bit about this growing unholy alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia and some of the other Middle Eastern countries that have been historically so anti-Israel?
Yes, it's been a real coup for Israel. It's been the only break really in the Arab bloc, where the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, which by the way is anti-Semitic and reactionary and stuff, since they're so closely allied with the U.S., they still don't. Not only they still don't have relations with Israel. People with Israeli passports are not allowed on their planes. I mean, it's still a long ways from a full rapprochement. In Mexico, the Saudi ambassador continues to go to Palestinian functions in Mexico City, but it certainly looks like Israel's going to have a military coup, not a military, but a diplomatic coup, a diplomatic victory, if it's able to break the Arab bloc in opposition. At this point, the only Muslim states, Turkey, which at this point is very anti-Israel, even though it still has an embassy, Jordan and Egypt, where in both Jordan and Egypt you have a mass rejection of any sort of normalization and ties with Israel. If Israel played its cards right, it could probably advance a lot more. Things like this nation state stuff, all the attacks on Muslim holy places, all this stuff just makes its isolation greater in the region. But there's no doubt that the Saudi monarchy is completely allied with Washington and would be very happy to sell out the Palestinians, who they also, by the way, and this is true throughout the Arab world, the Arab reactionary governments have always viewed the Palestinian refugee population in their countries as a source of discontent and a source of unrest. And despite the anti-Israel rhetoric that they all use, including in Saudi Arabia, up until very, very recently, despite the pro-Palestinian rhetoric, they have always moved to suppress any sort of Palestinian activism, because they fear their own masses a lot more than they fear Israel or the United States.
Sally?
wanted to back up a little bit. I read in only one place once that one of the reasons that Britain and the UN, after the Second World War, was interested in having Palestine for the Jews was because they wanted a Western face in the Middle East. It happens to be oil wells there, and so this was a very important move for them. It wasn't that they were interested in saving the Jews so much, but it had more to do with the political, military, economic.
Well, not only that, the doors were closed to Jewish immigration by the majority. There were interviews after World War II among Jewish prisoners in Buchenwald. Only 25% wanted to go to Palestine. People wanted to get as far away from Europe. They wanted to go basically the United States and Canada, and others to Australia. There was a very conscious policy by Britain and the United States and Canada to close its doors, both during World War II and after World War II, to Jewish immigration. So Britain had its own conflict, and then Britain certainly closed the doors of Palestine. But the United States was very, very much against Jewish immigration. There's a whole bunch of books about Allied complicity in the Holocaust with that, where even bills to allow 10,000 Jewish children into the United States during the war were defeated in the US Congress. But, you know, it was, after World War II, it was the use of a desperate refugee population to establish that state, and you know, with very tragic, very, very tragic consequences. By the way, the Soviet Union also supported the partition in 1948, and even supplied arms through Czechoslovakia.
Well, if I could just add one more thing. I think a lot of us here are U.S. citizens. We pay taxes, and we support Israel. I mean, imagine the over $3 billion a year. I would like to hear you talk more about why the U.S. is so interested in maintaining that stronghold there in the Middle East. Why do we put up with all this? Can you talk more about that?
Okay, I thought I'd mentioned that. Why don't we take a round of questions and stuff, so I can order them, because I'll repeat each one.
Do you see any influence from Israel on the actions that the U.S. is now taking with Iran?
Iran. Oh.
Okay, anybody who hasn't asked a question yet? Okay.
I was interested in your perspective. Why do you think the U.S. media is not reporting the Palestinian side of the issues, I should say, plural?
Cliff will add one more.
Okay, you started by defining the Zionist project for Israel as settler colonialism. Of a country to be defined by the ethnicity of a group. The parallels with the United States in our history is striking. The United States was a settler country.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely.
For Europeans, and that historical legacy is being articulated again now by the white supremacist movement in the U.S. You want to explore these historical parallels a bit?
Yep. I'll take a plug on this. Okay, I said I went into a thing on the Israel. It's a strategic role played by Israel that is behind the United States' solid support. Israel is the most stable state in the Middle East. There is not going to be a revolution in Israel Even during the Vietnam War, when the youth around the entire world were rising up against the US war in Vietnam, Israel was the one country where there was absolutely rock bottom support for the United States. Israel is the only country, the only country in the United Nations that supports the US blockade of Israel, of Cuba. There's no question that on all strategic questions, Israel is a very firm ally, and an ally that can provide arms to countries that the US cannot openly sell weapons to. It's an outpost of US imperialist strategic interests in that zone. It does not depend on conjunctural factors. I have no doubt about the case of Trump. The case of Obama, for example, there's no question that he felt very uncomfortable with a lot of Israeli actions. The case of Obama, that was another question. There is no question the alignment between Trump, Netanyahu is the Israeli version of Trump on every level. His method, the lying, the racism, I mean, it is a perfect alliance. And the Trump base of support, which is not the Jewish community, the evangelicals are the most fanatical supporters of the idea of Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel. Part of it's a religious rap. That is, which Bush also was wedded to. That, according to their theory, Jesus Christ cannot return until the Jews have been reestablished in Zion. After Jesus Christ returns, then all the Jews and everybody else disappears, but that's another question. But I mean, you're talking about tens of millions of Christian fundamentalists. And on the question of Iran, I said Netanyahu has been pushing, to destroy the Iran deal. It's the hard line. This hard line alliance between Israeli and U.S. hawks that shows absolutely no sign of weakening on any level. And it's been extended internationally with other right-wing forces in Europe. Forces, traditionally anti-Semitic. Now the media, okay, it's gotten a little better. Lately I've seen some stuff in the New York Times, a little more critical, editorial commentators and stuff. It's amazing how little coverage the Palestinian point of view gets in the media. And I said, Israel really gets away with a lot in terms of the discourse on anti-Semitism, which is really outrageous. That the definition, which has been bought by the media, is that if you don't accept the right to establish a racially exclusive state, then you're an anti-Semitic. It's just absolutely astounding. It's absolutely astounding. There's a witch hunt underway in the British Labour Party right at this moment on this question. And it's really amazing the role of the mass media. Fortunately, in internet, there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of bad stuff, but a lot of good stuff in the internet. Counterpunch magazine has a lot of good stuff. There's a lot of Palestinian sources, a lot of blogs, there's a real lot of stuff. And the Israeli opposition also produces some really first-class material, and the intellectual life in Israel is pretty vibrant. And you have a lot of young historians, a lot of academics that do a lot of serious research. A lot of the founding myths of Israel have been demolished by Israeli historians. That the Arab population fled, it's not even used that more. They used to say that the Arab population fled because they were told to by their leadership, saying that they could return when the Jews were killed off. Now it is virtually universally established, because documents have come out from the Israeli military and the Israeli government saying that they knew that in order to establish a state with a Jewish majority, they had to get rid of 750,000 Palestinians. That was the only way they could do that. They couldn't be in a state, they couldn't declare a state where they were in a minority. So, and this is now new documents that have come out. And it's not, the mainstream media continues to get its information from UPI, AP, and other sources. And Congress, of course, is dominated. The discourse in the United States is the only country in the world, really, where you have such an incredibly one-sided discourse, but trying to make a parallel between the two. Well, that there are extremists on both sides, and things, or that Israel wants to live in peace because it says it wants to live in peace. I mean, no other government in the world that had this, that God gave us this land and we're not giving it back, would be able to be considered to be a partner for peace. It's really incredible. Sometimes when you read this stuff, it's just mind-boggling, you know, how dare they come off with these types of arguments, you know, theological arguments that no other situation would be. Sort of like I said in the case of the U.S., where it's also, okay, the U.S. certainly is a colonial settler state, and it's similar to Israel in the sense that the interest was not in using Indians for labor power. But the Israeli colonization took place in a period where colonialism was on the way out, not in 100 years previously. So, you know, I said today these arguments, and we're not talking about things from 500 years ago. You're talking about things from, you know, the last century, even from as of 1948. So, you know, the things that the U.S. could get away with in 1786 or in 1876 or the beginning of the 20th century, today could not be justified. And the U.S., of course, part of it was, I mean, it was a fake justification also of, throughout Latin America, of bringing Christianity to the nation. Okay, no one in Israel has that theory that they were bringing civilization to the Palestinians. It was, you know, it's not an ethnic racial hatred on the Nazi scale. It was a thing that they wanted, an ethnically pure state. And the only way to achieve that was through a policy of ethnic cleansing. And that ethnically pure state is a racist and fundamentally anti-democratic project, because you cannot have a democratic state that disenfranchises the majority of the people living there. That is, boils down to that. It cannot be made simpler, and you know they can hope that this thing will go away, that they can drive people out or whatever. That is not happening. The Palestinians, the birth rate is very good. It's considered a form of resistance. When the state of Israel was established in 1948, after the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians, between 120 and 150,000 Palestinians remained. That is called within the Green Line. The Green Line's the 1948 border. That population is today about 1.5 million. That has been a tenfold increase in the number of Palestinian citizens inside the state of Israel. And you have that situation, and among young Israelis, young secular and democratic-minded Israelis, the immigration from Israel is a very strong phenomenon. People don't want to live in a state that they viewed as increasingly theocratic, where the ultra-Orthodox control everything, including education, where you can get stoned if you go on a car in a religious neighborhood. So you have hundreds of thousands of Israelis that are bailing on the state and immigrating to other countries. It's sort of a shame because it takes away the democratic component left in the country. But it's a real problem for the Zionist leadership in Israel, where they still don't have a way of how they're going to resolve this problem. If they want to keep the West Bank, how they're going to be able to do that without maintaining a permanent policy of oppression of the majority of the inhabitants of the country, and how they can present that to the world as the only democracy in the Middle East. And it's a real problem for them, and they have no way out of that. They have no way out of that dilemma.
We have a couple more questions? Yes, okay.
Sorry to speak again, but I want to thank you for bringing together all those diverse threads into a cohesive tapestry. So now I imagine you're speaking pretty much to the choir here. And now that you've got my blood pressure raised, where do you suggest we go with this? Because here we are in this little paradise, okay? And many people are socially conscious, I'm sure. Do you suggest that we say, I'm going to deduct this percentage of my taxes from the government because this percentage is what we're going to support Israel? What do we do with all of the, now that you've raised that level of frustration and anxiety even more?
Okay, I'm not that familiar with the situation inside the United States. My work is in Mexico, not the United States, so I'm not that familiar. These tax things, during the Vietnam War, I know that thing of not paying your phone tax, these things generally don't have any sort of impact. These individual solutions. The BDS is important because it has a mass character, because it politically isolates Israel. It's not important because you feel good that you haven't spent 15 pesos buying the chocolate that's made in Israel. Depends on who you are and where you're from, putting pressure on elected representatives, people who are of Jewish background, either religiously organized or otherwise. There are a lot of groups that run the gauntlet. You have liberal Zionist groups that generally are appalled by the occupation, although have not broken with Zionism. You have active anti-Zionist groups. Now you have young people. They have an incredible program that young Jews can go free to visit Israel. It's called the Birthright Program. But young Jews are walking out of the program. They go to Israel and they ask tough questions, and when they don't get an answer, they're denouncing and leaving the program. So there are lots of ways, depends on where one lives, and within the Jewish community, that type of thing is very important. It's very important in the United States, the alliances that have been formed between Muslim and Jewish communities on the question against ultra-right attacks and against Islamophobia, against Trump's immigration policy, all that sort of stuff. The thing is, to use people's pressure, write letters to editors, if people are journalists, to write stuff on the internet, to have a constant campaign to denounce the racist state of Israel. That's what I would say, more than trying to. I don't know what the tax laws in the United States. Yeah, no. There are people. There are people in Mexico, everywhere around the world, particularly in Mexico. No matter what the injustice, there are people who have the answers to boycott Coca-Cola. I don't know why Coca-Cola is maybe symbolism or something. But after the attack on Gaza, the assemblies we had in Mexico City, people boycott Coca-Cola. I go, why? Why? It's not Israeli. And what is it about Coca-Cola that if you want to drink Coca-Cola, be my guest. Just don't claim it's going to move the world 2 centimeters toward social justice. But the boycott in the United States, the BDS campaign has been strong, but it's been on a local level, and it's been very successful, as in the case of South Africa, with sports matches, with cultural programs, and the BDS has been very intelligent about not extending it to Israeli citizens on an individual level. On an academic level, it's with academics or academic institutions with ties to the Israeli government and military, not against an Israeli singer or stuff like that, many of whom are progressive, by the way.
Just so people are aware, BDS has a website. You can go on there and you can look at particular things that they're supporting, boycotts and divestment and sanctions against. Hewlett Packard is one of the big corporations in the U.S. that's very complicit in the infrastructure in Israel, so that's a target that your business, your community, your church, and you also find on the BDS website lists of organizations, mostly religious, but some non-profit groups that have signed on.
If there are any Mexican citizens here, it's our responsibility to demand that our government recognize the state of Palestine. Right now, Palestine, it's called a special office. It's not a full embassy. Israel's main supplier of oil is Mexico. So rather than in my opinion, rather than a futile attempt to try to avoid Israeli products, which are few and far between, of a campaign to demand, which is an ongoing campaign, to demand full recognition by the part of the Mexican government of Palestine, which the majority of the world governments already do, not Mexico or Colombia, full diplomatic relation with Palestine, and stop selling oil to Israel.
Jim?
Talk a little bit about, I don't know if people are familiar with the horror of the daily living in Gaza. Could you talk a little bit?
It's people saying that the situation is approaching levels of being unlivable, where Israel had the borders have been closed to food, and also think that there's a naval blockade. People are going hungry. People have electricity like 2 hours a day. There are no it's a complete, it is a blockade. Gaza is not under Israeli occupation like the West Bank, but it is under complete Israeli blockade. And it's a thing of punishing the population. The Israeli government says everyone living in Gaza is considered terrorist, considered Hamas. There's no innocence, say openly, there are no innocents in Gaza. So it is a brutal campaign where it is just daily life has become an absolute horror on every level of getting the most basic supplies in. And I said for the last couple of weeks, I think they've been blocking energy, Israel controls naval, air, and land access to Gaza and is in league with Egypt in closing the border. So it's a prison of about 2 million people with no way out of that situation. I said it is a breeding ground for all sorts of fundamentalism and support for dumb terrorist activities and stuff. And I can certainly see the point of a young Palestinian when he sees a jet overhead emblazoned with the Star of David. I can certainly see why that anger would be directed toward any Israeli or Jewish target. I can certainly see that. But as I said, the situation, the Western aid agencies are saying that the situation is rapidly approaching the situation of the area being completely unlivable for its inhabitants. Yeah, Sheila.
Do you know anything about the boats that have recently tried to block the
Oh, I don't know what it's called in English.
blockade, coming with medications? And
Yeah, is it called flotilla in English? What's it called?
It's Norwegian boats.
Yeah, what's it called in English? Flotilla?
Flotillas, yeah.
Yeah, actually we were going to participate with Mexicans. For some reason it wasn't possible. There was even some congressional deputies that were going to go on it and think it wasn't possible for some coordination. It's been a very highly visible. There are Israeli Jewish citizens, by the way, on the boats. And it's a type of activity of the Solidarity movement, which has been growing a lot around the world. In some countries you've had huge demonstrations, hundreds of thousands in Great Britain, big demonstration of 30,000 in Chicago around Gaza not too long ago. Big demonstrations. And the flotilla is a very public thing in which Greece and Turkey have been involved. There was a big diplomatic dispute because it was with the Turkish flag. They both had a Turkish flag. It's been the type of thing of breaking the humanitarian blockade. They've been attacked the last couple of days. They were boarded by Israeli military who brutally beat the crew members and the people on the ships and destroyed the humanitarian aid. The Gaza situation it's difficult to exaggerate how desperate the situation
And where
is
is
in
it
Gaza.
being reported? Is it being reported in Mexico?
Oh yeah. In Mexico, it's the Coordinadora, for example, has good coverage of that. The problem with most of the Mexican dailies is that all of the international news comes from Western wire services, with the exception, for example, of the Chinese, Xinhua, Russia Today, Prensa Latina, the Cuban news agency, and I would strongly recommend the English language Telesur. You can get it on your app for free on the phone. It's live on internet. It has very good, they have correspondence in Palestine, and it's very good. And even the Israeli press, Haaretz, which is like the New York Times of Israel, their coverage is increasingly critical, very openly critical of apartheid Israel and the racism and the fanaticism. It's well worth taking a look at the Haaretz. You have to pay to read the articles. The Haaretz page. The Jewish Daily Forward in New York has a lot of critical articles as well. And there's some Israeli pages like 972. 972 is the barcode for Israel. So there's a web page, I think it's called 972. And they've got some very, very good videos and coverage of the situation within Israel. There's a web page also of a group that I had contact with called the Alternative News Center that has a good web page in English for material. It's a joint effort. The Alternative News Center is a joint collective of Palestinians and Israeli anti-Zionists. And they've got very good coverage from within. And there's the Communist Party of Israel has an English web page as well. And so there are a lot, you have to do some looking, but fortunately the internet in some levels has democratized it, not for the bulk of the population that doesn't go looking for exotic web pages, but for people who want to follow developments in Palestine, the information is available. For people here who speak Spanish, if you want to give me your email, we have a very good, if I say so myself, I'm the administrator of it, email list with very good information, but it's only in Spanish.
In the United States, there's an organization, Jewish Voice for Peace.
It's their videos are excellent. Their videos are very, very good.
And a lot of young people engage through that organization.
It's an organization of thousands and thousands of young people. Look on YouTube, the Jewish Voice of Peace. It's written in very simple style, without rhetoric. It's very convincing arguments. It's very good. It's in Spanish also. Some of the better ones of their videos are subtitled in Spanish. As is, those who could not be there yesterday, look on the YouTube for Occupation 101, which is a very good video. I would recommend two others. One is called The History of Zionism, or Zionist History, by an Israeli soldier. Very, very good documentary. And another is, I think I sent you Common Dreams, it's called. It's by a Christian group in the US. Very good from a technical movie point of view and from information. But I would we use a lot the Occupation 101, the Jewish Voice of Peace videos, which are like 6 minutes, it's forever, and the Zionist story. Now there is another video we tried to use for assemblies, but it was a little more complicated, called Nakba. Nakba is Arab for catastrophe, referring to 1948. It's by the Al Jazeera TV studio. The only problem is, it's 6 hours and 20 minutes, so you really have to be interested in Palestine. I don't want to lock the doors and say, we'll see you in 6 hours and 20 minutes. But it's a very thorough, to put it mildly, exposition of that. So I would strongly recommend the Zionist History, or History of Zionism, I forget which one it is, because I use it in Spanish, Historia Sionista in Spanish. It's by an Israeli soldier, it's very good. The Occupation 101, which is for introduction to the occupation. The Al Jazeera video, and the videos for Jewish Voice for Peace.
Susan? Jim reminded me to put in a plug for Democracy Now!
Oh, I've never heard that.
Oh, yeah. Well, a few archives. Norman Finkelstein is on there often, and he's one of the few academic voices that speaks out about Palestinian rights.
Okay, one last question perhaps.
Doesn't anybody disagree here?